The snow fell steadily that December evening, blanketing the streets in a silence that felt heavier than usual. Liam pulled his scarf tighter against the biting wind as he pushed open the door to a small cafe. Inside, the warm air carried the smell of burnt coffee and pastries that had been sitting too long in the display case. He scanned the room, looking for the man he was supposed to meet, but the place was nearly empty. On the table in front of him was the letter, creased from his repeated readings. It had arrived at his doorstep days earlier, delivered in an old envelope sealed with red wax. He didn't recognize the strange emblem pressed into it, a symbol that resembled a star surrounded by jagged, broken lines. The message inside had been brief and cryptic. You have been chosen to direct the midnight carol. Your voice will awaken what has long slept. Meet us at St. Cecilia's Church at 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Do not be late. He had hesitated. He wasn't a stranger to odd requests. As a choir director, he often received invitations to events, but this was different. St. Cecilia's Church had been abandoned for decades, ever since a fire had gutted its interior during a Christmas Eve service. The tragedy was whispered about in the town, a congregation trapped inside, their screams echoing over the carol they had been singing. The sound of the bell above the cafe door jolted Liam from his thoughts. A tall, thin man in a long black coat entered, his pale face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His presence seemed to suck the warmth from the room. Without a word, the man crossed the cafe and slid into the seat opposite Liam. "You're here," the man said, his voice dry and hollow, as though it had been strained from disuse. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folder, placing it on the table. "These are the parts for your singers. Study them carefully. The midnight carol must be perfect." Before Liam could ask any questions, the man stood and walked out, leaving behind the faint scent of candle wax and soot. At home, Liam pored over the sheets of music in the folder. The notes were intricate, weaving an unsettling melody that seemed to linger in his ears long after he stopped humming it. The lyrics were in Latin, and though Liam wasn't fluent, he recognized words like angeli and porta, references to angels and gates. The more he studied the carol, the more it felt like a spell than a song. When Christmas Eve arrived, Liam made his way to St. Cecilia's Church. The snow was falling harder now, muffling his footsteps as he approached the dark silhouette of the church. Its charred walls loomed against the night sky, and the faint light from the broken stained glass windows gave the appearance of flickering eyes. Inside, the church was cold and dark, lit only by a few flickering candles. The air smelled of ash and mildew. A group of people stood near the altar, dressed in black robes. Their faces were pale and emotionless, and their eyes followed Liam as he entered. "Welcome," came a voice from the shadows. The tall man stepped forward, his coat billowing as though caught in an invisible wind. "Take your place, maestro." Liam hesitated, but something in the man's gaze compelled him forward. He stepped onto the platform near the altar, raising his arms to signal the choir to begin. The first notes filled the air, haunting and strange. The melody wound through the church like a living thing, and as it built, the air seemed to grow heavier. Liam could feel it pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. He glanced at the congregation seated in the pews. At first, they appeared to be mannequins, lifeless, unmoving. But as the choir sang, their heads began to tilt unnaturally, their mouths twitching into grotesque, lopsided smiles. Their dark eyes glittered, reflecting the candlelight like glass. A low rumble began to resonate from beneath the church, growing louder with each verse. The floor trembled and the temperature plummeted. Frost spread across the walls, and the candles dimmed, their flames flickering violently. From the shadows behind the altar, something began to emerge. It was vast, its form impossible to define. Its surface shimmered and shifted, as though it were made of smoke and mirrors. Thousands of glowing eyes stared out from its writhing mass, each one fixed on Liam. "You have awakened," the entity said. Its voice wasn't a sound, but a vibration that shook the walls and rattled Liam's bones. "Sing or be consumed." Liam's arms trembled as he directed the choir to continue. Their voices rose, now tinged with pain and desperation, but they didn't falter. The entity seemed to grow larger, filling the church with its presence. The congregation began to move, their stiff limbs jerking unnaturally as they turned to face Liam. "Finish the carol," the tall man hissed, suddenly standing close to Liam. His face was peeling, revealing blackened flesh beneath. "Or it will consume us all." Liam's voice joined the choir's, his words stumbling over the unfamiliar Latin. The entity loomed closer, its eyes closing one by one with each line of the song. The air became suffocating, and Liam felt his vision blur. Finally, the carol reached its final note. The entity let out a deafening roar that shook the church to its foundation. Its form began to collapse inward, imploding into the shadows, until nothing remained but silence. Liam collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. When he looked up, the congregation was motionless, their faces frozen in eerie smiles. The tall man stood over him, his face now entirely featureless, as though it had been smoothed over like wet clay. "You've done well," the man said. His voice was faint, echoing as though from a great distance. But the song is never truly over. Before Liam could respond, the man disappeared, leaving him alone in the ruined church. For weeks after, Liam tried to return to his normal life, but every night as he lay in bed, he could hear the carol faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing day. And one night, he woke to find the tall man standing at the foot of his bed. "It's time to sing again," the man whispered. The snowstorm raged outside, howling like a living creature. Nadia sat curled up in her favorite armchair, a wool blanket draped over her legs, and a steaming mug of hot chocolate in her hands. The tiny cabin, nestled deep in the forest, was her sanctuary, a place to escape the chaos of the city and spend Christmas in solitude. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Nadia glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was just past midnight. She sighed, the sound heavy in the quiet room. She had hoped the storm would ease by now, but it seemed to only be getting worse. As she sipped her hot chocolate, a loud knock echoed through the cabin. Nadia froze. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. She placed her mug on the side table and stood, her heart thudding in her chest. Peering through the frost-covered window, she could barely make out a figure standing on the porch. It was hard to tell in the swirling snow, but the figure seemed unusually tall, its frame almost skeletal. "Hello?" she called through the door, her voice shaky. "Who's there?" No response came, but the knocking continued, more insistent now. Against her better judgment, Nadia unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The freezing wind bit at her skin and snow swirled into the cabin. Standing on the porch was a man, if he could be called that. He was gaunt, his face pale and hollow-cheeked, and his eyes were a piercing shade of blue that almost glowed in the darkness. He wore a thin, tattered coat and no gloves, yet he didn't seem affected by the cold. "Please," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm lost. May I come in?" Nadia hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to close the door. But the man's sunken eyes were filled with desperation, and she couldn't leave him out in the storm. "Just for a little while," she said, stepping aside to let him in. The stranger stepped into the cabin, and immediately the temperature seemed to drop. Nadia shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Thank you," the man said, his voice flat. He didn't meet her eyes as he moved to stand near the fire. "What were you doing out there?" Nadia asked, trying to keep her tone light. "I was walking," he replied. "I got lost." "In a storm like this?" she asked, frowning. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stood perfectly still, staring into the flames. His presence was unnerving, and Nadia couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "I'll make you some tea," she said, more to fill the silence than anything else. She moved to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she filled the kettle. When she returned to the living room, the man was no longer by the fire. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked around the cabin, but there was no sign of him. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing in the small space. No answer. Nadia checked the door. It was still locked. Panic began to set in. She grabbed her phone, intending to call for help, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The battery had been fully charged earlier. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The fire in the hearth dimmed to a faint glow, barely illuminating the room. And then she saw him. The man was standing in the corner, his body unnaturally still, his glowing blue eyes fixed on her. "You let me in," he said, his voice echoing strangely. Nadia backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. "What do you want?" she managed to choke out. "To be warm," he said, taking a step forward. "But it's never enough." As he moved closer, the air grew colder. Frost began to creep across the walls and floor, and Nadia's breath hung in the air like mist. She grabbed the fireplace poker, holding it out in front of her like a weapon. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice shaking. The man smiled, but it was a terrible, hollow thing. "You can't stop it," he said. "Once you invite the cold in, it never leaves." His form began to change, his body elongating and twisting. His skin turned ashen, and his eyes burned brighter, like two icy flames. Frost spread from his feet, encasing the cabin in a layer of shimmering ice. Nadia turned and ran, slipping on the icy floor as she made her way to the bedroom. She slammed the door shut and pressed her back against it, her heart pounding. From the other side, she heard his voice, now distorted and inhuman. "Let me in, Nadia. It's so cold out here." She grabbed her phone again, desperately pressing buttons, but it was dead. The frost on the walls began to spread, creeping toward her like a living thing. The temperature plummeted, and her breath came in shallow gasps as the cold seeped into her bones. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. It was impossible to tell. The knocking had stopped, and the cabin was silent. Nadia shivered uncontrollably, her body numb and weak. Suddenly, the door creaked open. She didn't have the strength to move or scream. The man stood in the doorway, his skeletal frame silhouetted against the faint glow of the icy cabin. "You should have stayed warm," he whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. He reached out a hand, his fingers like icicles, and touched her cheek. A wave of unbearable cold washed over her, and everything went black. The next day, the storm cleared. A search party found the cabin encased in a thick layer of ice, the windows frosted over from the inside. When they broke down the door, they found Nadia sitting in her armchair, her body frozen solid, a faint smile on her lips. And in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the reflection of the frosted window, were two glowing blue eyes. The Christmas tree stood tall in the corner of the living room, its branches heavy with ornaments that shimmered in the dim light. Ellie stepped back to admire her handiwork, a smile tugging at her lips. This was her first Christmas in her new house, and everything had to be perfect. The house, an old Victorian with creaking floorboards and drafty windows, had been a steal at the price she'd gotten it for. The real estate agent had been vague about the property's history, but Ellie didn't care. It was hers now, and she was determined to make it feel like home. As she placed the last ornament on the tree, a delicate glass angel with a cracked wing, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her mom. "Don't stay up too late decorating. Merry Christmas, sweetheart." Ellie smiled and typed a quick reply. It was just past 11 p.m., and the house was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the occasional pop of the wood in the fireplace and the soft hum of the heater struggling against the cold. She turned off the overhead lights, leaving the room bathed in the warm glow of the Christmas tree. The ornaments twinkled like tiny stars, and for a moment, Ellie felt a sense of, but then she noticed something strange. One of the ornaments, a silver bauble, seemed to be moving. It wasn't swaying gently like the others. It was trembling, as if vibrating on its own. Ellie frowned, stepping closer to the tree. "Probably just a draft," she muttered, though the windows were shut tight. As she reached out to touch the ornament, it suddenly spun violently, clinking against the other decoration. Ellie yelped and jerked her hand back. The bauble stilled, hanging innocently on its branch, as if nothing had happened. Her heart thudded in her chest. She stared at it. She told herself it was her imagination. She was tired, and the shadows cast by the tree lights were playing tricks on her. Deciding it was time for bed, Ellie turned off the tree lights and headed upstairs. That night, Ellie dreamed of the ornament. In her dream, they weren't decorations at all. They were eyes, dozens of them, watching her from the branches of the tree. The silver bauble that had spun earlier was the largest of them, its surface gleaming like a predator's gaze. When she woke, her room was freezing. The heater must have gone out again. She groaned and pulled the covers tighter around her. But then she heard it, a faint sound coming from downstairs. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something knocking against the glass. Her breath hitched as she strained to listen. The sound grew louder, more insistent. Probably just the wind, she told herself, but the words felt hollow. Summoning her courage, Ellie slipped out of bed and grabbed her phone. She crept down the staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight. When she reached the living room, she stopped dead in her tracks. The Christmas tree was glowing. The lights were still off, but the ornaments themselves seemed to emit a faint, unnatural light. The silver bauble was the brightest of them all, pulsing like a heartbeat. As Ellie stared, frozen in fear, the bauble turned to face her. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was moving, and it was watching her. A low whisper filled the room, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You brought us here," it said, cold and hollow. Ellie stumbled backward, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The ornaments began to move, spinning faster and faster until they blurred into a whirlwind of colors. The whisper grew louder, rising into a chorus of voices that echoed with anger and pain. "You hung us on the tree. You gave us life. Now, we'll take yours." The tree's branches reached out, twisting and writhing like skeletal hands. Ellie screamed and turned to run, but the air grew heavy, and her legs felt like they were sinking into the floor. From the corner of her eye, she saw the glass angel at the top of the tree. Its cracked wing began to mend itself, the fracture glowing with an eerie light. The angel's head turned slowly, its painted eyes locking onto Ellie. "You cannot escape," the voices said in unison. The branches wrapped around her, pulling her toward the tree. She struggled, her screams muffled by the oppressive weight of the air. The silver bauble loomed in front of her, its surface reflecting her terrified face. In that moment, Ellie saw flashes of other faces in the bauble's gleam. Strangers, their expressions frozen in fear and agony. And then she understood. The ornaments weren't decorated. They were souls, trapped and bound to the tree. As the branches tightened around her, Ellie felt a cold, burning sensation spread through her body. Her vision blurred, and the last thing she saw was the glass angel's painted smile, twisting into something far too real. A fresh blanket of snow covered the tiny village of Hollow Pines, its pristine whiteness untouched in the early morning light. Daniel, a teenager with a knack for creativity, had decided to make a snowman in the yard that Christmas Eve. His younger sister, Lily, eagerly helped, giggling as they shaped the snow into a tall figure. "It needs a face," Lily said, holding up 2 pieces of coal. Daniel nodded and stuck the coal onto the snowman for eyes. They added a crooked carrot for a nose and a strip of an old scarf around its neck. Stepping back, they admired their creation. "It looks kind of creepy," Lily whispered, shivering as she stared into the coal eyes. Daniel laughed. "It's just a snowman, Lily." But even he had to admit there was something unsettling about it. The coal eyes seemed to reflect the light in an unnatural way, almost as if they were watching. That night, as the family gathered for dinner, the wind picked up, howling outside the windows. Lily kept glancing toward the yard, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sweater. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" their mother asked. "Nothing," Lily said quickly, but her gaze darted to the window again. Daniel followed her eyes and froze. The snowman was still standing in the yard, but something about it had changed. The scarf, which had been tied loosely around its neck, now hung lower, as if someone had tugged on it. The coal eyes seemed darker, almost glinting in the dim light. "It's just the wind," Daniel muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Later that night, Daniel was awoken by a soft sound. It was faint at first, like the crunch of snow underfoot, but it grew louder, closer. He sat up in bed, his breath visible in the icy air. The sound stopped. He strained his ears, but all he could hear was the wind outside. Shaking his head, he lay back down, pulling the covers over him. But then, it came again, closer. Crunch, crunch. Daniel sat up again, his heart racing. The sound was coming from outside his window. He crept to the window and peeked through the frost-covered glass. At first, he saw nothing but the snow-covered yard, but then his eyes landed on the snowman. It had moved. The snowman was no longer standing in the middle of the yard. It was closer to the house, its coal eyes staring directly at his window. Daniel stumbled back, his heart pounding. "It's not possible," he whispered. The next morning, Daniel tried to convince himself it had been a dream. But when he looked outside, the snowman was still closer to the house, its coal eyes locked on his bedroom window. "Daniel!" Lily's voice startled him. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale. "The snowman. It's scaring me." "It's just snow, Lily," he said, though his voice wavered. "No, it's not," she insisted. "I saw it move last night." Daniel's stomach churned. He didn't want to scare Lily further, so he forced a smile. "I'll take it down, okay?" She nodded hesitantly, her eyes wide. Daniel bundled up and headed outside. The air was bitterly cold, and the snow crunched under his boots. He grabbed a shovel and approached the snowman. Up close, it was even more disturbing. The coal eyes seemed almost alive, glinting with a malicious intelligence. The crooked carrot nose had sunk lower, giving it a sinister grin. Daniel raised the shovel and swung it at the snowman's head. The snow crumbled easily, collapsing into a heap. He kept swinging until there was nothing left but a pile of snow and scattered coal. Satisfied, he turned to go back inside. But as he stepped onto the porch, he felt it, a chill that wasn't from the wind. It was as if something was watching him. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The snowman was back. It stood in the middle of the yard, perfectly intact, its coal eyes gleaming. Daniel dropped the shovel and ran inside, slamming the door behind him. That night, the entire family heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps crunching in the snow. The power flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and crept to the living room, his parents and Lily close behind. When he shone the beam out the window, his blood ran cold. The snowman was right outside the house, its face pressed against the glass. Frost spread from where it touched, crackling like ice forming on a pond. The coal eyes glowed with a cold, otherworldly light. "It's not real," his father whispered, but even he sounded up. The snowman raised a branch-like arm and raked it across the window, leaving deep, jagged scratches in the glass. "We have to get out of here!" Daniel's mother screamed. The family scrambled to the car, the wind whipping around them. As Daniel fumbled with the keys, he glanced back at the house. The snowman was gone. But then he saw it, standing in the middle of the road, blocking their path. The car's headlights illuminated it, casting a long, twisted shadow behind it. Daniel slammed on the gas, swerving around the snowman. For a moment, he thought they were safe. But then a shadow moved in the rearview mirror. The snowman was chasing them. It moved with unnatural speed, its coal eyes glowing brighter. Frost began to creep along the car windows, and the engine sputtered as if the cold were seeping into its very core. "Keep going!" his father shouted. Daniel pushed the accelerator to the floor. The snowman was right behind them now, its grin widening as it reached for the car. Just as its branch-like hand scraped the back window, the car burst through the edge of the storm. The snowman stopped, its glowing eyes fading as it disappeared into the swirling snow. The family didn't stop driving until they reached the next town. They spent the rest of the night in a motel, too afraid to sleep. When they returned home the next day, the yard was empty. The snowman was gone. But deep in the snow, they found footprints, large human-like prints that led from the house into the woods. No one in the family ever spoke of the snowman, but every Christmas Eve, Daniel couldn't help but glance out the window, half expecting to see those coal eyes staring back at him. It was nearing midnight on New Year's Eve, and Emily sat alone in the dusty old cabin her family had rented in the woods. The rest of her friends had decided to head into town for the fireworks, but Emily, nursing a headache and craving solitude, had stayed behind. The cabin was quaint, its charm rooted in its old-fashioned decor, wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and walls lined with antique trinkets. Among them was a peculiar set of brass bells hanging by the window. The bells caught Emily's attention as she sipped her tea. They swayed gently, chiming faintly, though there was no breeze to stir them. "Must be the heater kicking," she murmured to herself, though the air was as cold as ever. As she stared at the bells, a faint feeling of unease settled over her. The chimes weren't random. They seemed almost deliberate, like a melody. She shook her head, blaming the eerie sensation on her headache, and decided to distract herself with a book. The cabin grew quieter as the hours passed, the only sound the occasional pop of the fire. Emily glanced at the clock. It was 11:45 p.m., just 15 minutes until midnight. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, and the brass bells jingled violently. Emily jumped, her book slipping from her hands. She stared at the window, her heart pounding. The wind stilled, but the bells kept ringing. The sound wasn't chaotic like before. It was rhythmic, almost like a chant. Emily's pulse quickened as she stood and approached the window. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the relentless chiming of the bells. And then she saw it. Outside, standing just beyond the tree line, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body cloaked in darkness. Emily couldn't make out any features, but its presence was undeniable. The figure raised a hand and the bells abruptly stopped. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the silence pressed down on her. She stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug, and fell to the floor. When she looked back at the window, the figure was gone. Emily tried to calm herself, convincing her racing mind that she had imagined it. The stress of the holidays, her headache, and the isolation, it was all playing tricks on her. But just as she began to relax, the bells chimed again. This time, they were deafening. The sound filled the cabin, reverberating through the walls. Emily clapped her hands over her ears, but the noise only grew louder, more insistent. The clock struck midnight, and the cabin plunged into darkness. Panic surged through Emily as she fumbled for her phone, its dim light the only thing keeping the oppressive darkness at bay. Come on," she muttered, trying to call her friends. But the screen displayed no signal. The bells chimed again, softer this time, but closer. Emily turned toward the sound, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. Her breath hitched. The figure was inside the cabin. It stood in the corner, its elongated frame barely fitting under the low ceiling. Its face, or lack thereof, was hidden beneath a hood, and its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides. "Who are you?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one hand, pointing at the bells by the window. Emily's eyes darted to the bells, which were now swinging wildly, though the air was still. The rhythmic chiming began again, each note vibrating in her chest. She turned back to the figure, but it was gone. The bells continued their haunting melody, drawing Emily toward the window. She tried to resist, but her legs moved as if they were no longer her own. The closer she got to the bells, the louder they rang, their sound filling her mind with a dizzying hum. "Stop!" she screamed, but the bells only grew louder. Her hand reached out, trembling, and touched the cold brass. The moment she made contact, the cabin disappeared. Emily found herself standing in a vast, snow-covered field. The wind howled around her, and the sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds. In the distance, she saw them. Figures, dozens of them, all cloaked in darkness like the one she had seen in the cabin. They stood in a circle, their heads bowed, and in the center of the circle was an enormous bell, its surface blackened and cracked. The figures began to chant, their voices low and guttural. The bell rang, its deep, resonant tone shaking the ground beneath Emily's feet. She tried to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was drawn forward, her footsteps dragging through the snow. As she approached the circle, the figures turned to face her. Their hoods fell back, revealing faces that were hollow and empty, their eyes glowing like embers. "You rang the bells!" they intoned in unison. "I didn't mean to," Emily cried, her voice cracking with fear. "You answered the call. Now you must join us." The ground beneath her opened, a yawning chasm of darkness. Emily screamed as she was pulled into the void, the sound of the bell's toll echoing in her ears. The next morning, Emily's friends returned to the cabin, laughing and chatting as they stepped inside. Their laughter stopped when they saw the bells. They were no longer brass, but blackened and cracked, their surfaces covered in frost, and hanging beneath them was a single strand of Emily's hair, frozen and brittle. It had been a quiet Christmas day for the Walker family. Snow blanketed the ground outside their cozy suburban home, and the warmth of the fireplace glowed softly in the living room. Julia, the youngest daughter, was curled up with a book by the tree while her parents cleaned up after their Christmas dinner. Her older brother, Mark, was scrolling through his phone on the couch, occasionally chuckling at memes. The tranquility was broken by a knock at the door. The knock was faint but persistent, echoing through the house. Julia glanced at the clock. It was nearly 11 p.m. "Who could that be?" her father muttered, walking toward the door. "Maybe carolers," her mother suggested, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. When Mr. Walker opened the door, he found no one there. The porch was empty, the only sign of life the snowflakes drifting lazily in the cold night air. "Probably some kids playing a prank," he said, shutting the door with a shrug. But as soon as he turned back toward the living room, the knock came again, louder this time. Mr. Walker swung the door open, irritation evident on his face. This time someone was there. A man stood on the porch, his face pale and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed too large for his thin frame. He wore a tattered coat, and his breath came out in visible puffs, though he didn't seem bothered by the cold. "Sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice low and rasping. "I'm lost, and it's so cold. Could I come in for just a moment to warm up?" Mrs. Walker appeared behind her husband, frowning. "Where are you headed?" "Just passing through," the man said vaguely. His eyes flicked to Julia, who was peeking at him from behind the Christmas tree. His lips curled into a faint smile. Mrs. Walker hesitated but nodded. "Of course. Come in. It's Christmas, after all." The man stepped inside, bringing with him a cold draft that extinguished the warmth of the fireplace. Julia shivered as he walked past her, his presence unsettling. "Thank you," the man said, his smile thin. "It's rare to find such kindness these days." Mark frowned, his fingers tightening around his phone. "Where exactly were you coming from?" The man's eyes fixed on him, unblinking. "Far away," he said cryptically. The Walkers exchanged uneasy glances. As the night went on, the man didn't seem eager to leave. He sat near the fire, his thin hands stretched toward the flames, though he didn't seem to feel the heat. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, even when his eyes were on the fire. His presence seemed to drain the light from the room, making the Christmas lights on the tree appear dimmer. "Would you like some coffee or tea?" Mrs. Walker offered, her voice strained. The man shook his head. "I don't drink." "Not even water?" Mark asked, his tone skeptical. The man turned to him slowly, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Not lately." By midnight, the atmosphere in the house had grown tense. The family was eager for the man to leave, but no one wanted to ask him directly. Finally, Mr. Walker cleared his throat. "It's late. Do you have a place to stay for the night?" The man rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. "I won't be staying much longer," his voice low. He turned to Julia, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You've been so kind to let me in. I hope you'll always remember this Christmas." Something about the way he said it made Julia's stomach churn. As the man walked toward the door, the lights on the Christmas tree flickered violently. The fireplace roared, the flames leaping high before dying down to embers. The man paused at the door and turned to the family one last time. "Do not answer the door again tonight," he said, his tone chilling. "No matter what you hear." Before anyone could respond, he stepped outside, disappearing into the falling snow. The Walkers stared at the closed door, their unease growing. "What the hell was that about?" Mark muttered. Mrs. Walker shook her head. "I don't know, but something felt wrong." Julia clung to her father's arm. "He scared me." Mr. Walker hugged her tightly. "It's okay, sweetheart. He's gone now." But then, the knocking began again. It was louder this time, more urgent. "Don't open it," Julia would, her voice trembling. Mr. Walker hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "What if it's someone who really needs help?" "No," Julia said firmly, remembering the man's warning. He said not to answer. The knocking turned into pounding, each thud rattling the door on its hinges. "Who's there?" Mr. Walker called, his voice shaky. There was no response, only the relentless pounding. Mark grabbed a poker from the fireplace, holding it like a weapon. "I don't like this." The pounding stopped. For a moment, the family stood in silence, the only sound their ragged breathing, and then they heard it. A voice, low and distorted, coming from the other side of the door. "Let me in," it whispered. Julia's blood ran cold. It wasn't the man's voice. It was something else, something inhuman. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." The doorknob rattled violently, and the family backed away. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out, plunging them into darkness. Julia clung to her mother as the voice continued, now coming from all around them. "Let me in! Let me in!" Mark swung the flashlight toward the window, and they saw it. Figures in the snow, dozens of them, their shapes barely visible in the darkness, their faces pressed against the glass, pale and lifeless, their eyes black pits. They were all whispering the same words. Let me in. It was a quiet Christmas Eve in the small town of Millfield, where the snow lay thick on the streets and the cold air carried the faint sound of holiday music. Clara, a librarian in her late 30s, was returning home after a long evening spent closing the library. The streets were eerily deserted, and the twinkling Christmas lights seemed to provide little comfort against the oppressive silence. Clara pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, her boots crunching through the snow as she hurried down the street. Her home was just a few blocks away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder but saw no one. The empty streets stretched behind her, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. Get a grip, she muttered to herself. As she turned the corner, she heard it, a faint, melodic humming. Clara froze, straining to hear. The sound was soft and haunting, like a distant carol sung by a single voice. It floated on the wind, growing louder as she stood motionless. Hello? She called, her voice trembling slightly. The humming stopped. Clara's heart raced as she quickened her pace, the sound of her boots against the snow feeling deafening in the stillness. She didn't look back again until she reached her front door. Once inside, Clara locked the door behind her and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. The warmth of her house wrapped around her, and she shook off her coat and boots, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling that had followed her home. She set about preparing for bed, her mind gradually calming as she brewed a cup of tea and lit the small Christmas tree in the corner of her living room. The soft glow of the lights and the crackle of the fireplace brought a sense of normalcy. But just as she settled onto the couch, the humming returned. This time, it was unmistakably close, coming from just outside her window. Clara's breath hitched as she turned toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, but the faint outline of a shadow flickered against the fabric. Someone was standing outside. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? The operator's calm voice answered. There's someone outside my house, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. They're humming a Christmas carol. The operator asked for her address and assured her that an officer would be dispatched. Stay inside and don't engage, the operator instructed. Clara nodded even though the operator couldn't see her. Minutes felt like hours as Clara sat frozen on the couch, her eyes glued to the window. The humming continued, the same eerie tune repeated over and over, and then it stopped. Clara held her breath, straining to hear any sound. The silence was suffocating. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. Ma'am, it's the police, a deep voice called. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding. She approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. A uniformed officer stood on her porch, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hat. Is everything okay in there? He asked, his voice muffled through the door. Clara hesitated but eventually unlocked the door, opening it just a crack. I'm Clara. I called about someone outside, she said. The officer nodded. We didn't see anyone, but we'll patrol the area. You should be safe now. Relieved, Clara thanked him and watched as he walked back to his car. Later that night, Clara lay in bed, the events of the evening playing over in her mind. She had just begun to drift off when she heard it again, the humming. It was inside the house. Clara shot upright in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. She reached for her phone, but it wasn't on the nightstand where she had left it. The humming grew louder, closer. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly opened her bedroom door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the Christmas tree downstairs. She crept toward the staircase, each step feeling like an eternity. As she reached the bottom, she saw him. A man stood by the Christmas tree, his back to her. He was tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned black coat and a top hat. His hands hung limp at his sides, and his head tilted slightly to one side as he hummed the haunting tune. Who are you? Clara managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stopped humming. Slowly he turned to face her. His eyes were hollow, black pits, and his mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. Merry Christmas, his voice a chilling whisper. Clara stumbled back, her legs giving out beneath her. The man stepped toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. Clara scrambled to her feet and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled, the lock wouldn't turn. She turned to see the man standing just a few feet away, his empty eyes fixed on her. Why are you doing this? She cried. You let me in, he said simply. I didn't. The man smiled wider. You opened the door to the officer. That was all I needed. Clara's mind reeled as the lights in the house flickered violently. The man raised a hand and the room filled with a deafening roar. When the neighbors found Clara the next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The Christmas tree stood untouched, the lights blinking softly, but Clara was gone. The only sign of her was a single black top hat lying on the floor by the fireplace, and faintly, almost imperceptibly, The sound of humming lingered in the air. It was Christmas Eve, and for the first time in years, Emma had decided to stay home. She had always traveled to visit family, but this year felt different. Her husband Jason had passed away earlier in the year, and she couldn't bring herself to face the festive cheer of her relatives without him. So, she rented a cozy little cabin in the woods, hoping that the solitude would bring her peace. The cabin was tucked away in the heart of a snow-covered forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor. Its rustic charm offered comfort, the warmth of the fireplace creating a comforting glow against the winter chill. Outside, the wind howled, whipping snowflakes into a frenzy. But inside, Emma felt secure, wrapping herself in blankets, with a hot cup of tea in hand. The fire crackled softly as she watched the flames dance, her thoughts wandering. Her grief still felt fresh, though it was starting to blend with the numbness of time. She hadn't expected to feel so alone, but here, in the quiet of the cabin, she could almost hear Jason's voice. As the clock struck midnight, a soft knock echoed through the stillness of the cabin. Emma froze, the cup of tea trembling in her hands. Who could be at her door in the middle of nowhere on Christmas Eve? She hadn't seen anyone since she arrived 2 days ago. Tentatively, she set the cup down and approached the door. The knock came again, followed by the faint sound of someone shuffling outside, as if waiting patiently. "Who's there?" Emma called out, her voice wavering slightly. There was no answer, only a deep, chilling silence. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, thinking it might be some prank, but something in her gut told her to open the door. Hesitantly, she undid the bolt and slowly opened it. Standing outside was a man, tall, gaunt, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to peer into her very soul. He was dressed in a tattered black coat, and his breath hung in the air like smoke. He didn't speak. Instead, he simply stared at her, his lips barely parting. "Can I help you?" Emma asked, her voice shaky. The man tilted his head slightly, almost as if considering her question. Then, in a voice so soft it almost felt like a whisper, he spoke. "May I come inside?" Emma's heart raced. She had never felt such an overwhelming sense of unease. But the way he stood there, unblinking, unmoving, with those unearthly eyes, terrified. "No," she replied firmly, stepping back from the door. "I'm sorry, but I'm alone here." The man's lips twitched to a faint smile. "I'm sorry to disturb you." And just like that, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the snowstorm. Emma shut the door quickly, bolting it shut. Her hands shook as she backed away, her mind racing. What had just happened? She had never seen that man before. Was he a traveler lost in the storm, or something else entirely? She tried to dismiss the encounter, but the image of his hollow eyes stayed with her, haunting her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The wind howled louder, and the cabin creaked in response to the storm outside. Emma sank into the couch, trying to calm her racing heart. Maybe she was just overthinking it. But then she heard it, a faint tapping at the window. Her blood ran cold as she stood up, moving toward the window with caution. She peered through the frosted glass, but all she could see was the blur of the snowstorm. No sign of anyone. Yet the tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent, like nails on glass. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the window, her mind a swirl of panic. The tapping grew louder, faster, almost frantic. She backed away from the window, heart pounding in her chest. "Stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Please, stop." But the tapping didn't stop. It grew more aggressive, echoing in the cabin like a desperate plea. Emma rushed to the front door and locked it again, this time checking every window, every lock, making sure everything was secure. The tapping never ceased, relentless and maddening. She sat in the corner of the living room, eyes darting toward the windows, her body frozen in fear. The storm outside raged, the howling wind making everything feel suffocating and oppressive. The silence between taps was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the tapping stopped. Emma exhaled shakily, her body aching with tension. She sat still for a long time, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was only silence. For hours, she dared not move, her eyes glued to the windows, the door. She didn't trust the quiet. When morning finally came, the storm had passed. Emma cautiously opened the door and stepped outside, the snow sparkling in the pale light of dawn. She scanned the area, but there was no sign of the man from the night before. The ground was pristine, untouched by footprints. As she turned to head back inside, something caught her eye, something small and black in the snow, just by the doorstep. It was a single crow feather. She knelt down, heart racing, and picked it up. The feather was soft, yet there was a chill to it that didn't belong. She stood up, looking around once more, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. When she turned to go back inside, the wind picked up again, swirling around her as if carrying a whisper. "Don't let me in," a voice seemed to say, a voice she knew far too well. Her heart stopped. It was Jason's voice. But that couldn't be possible. She spun around, scanning the empty woods behind her. But there was no one. The whispering voice came again, louder this time, from behind her. "Don't let me in!" She ran inside, slamming the door behind her, her hands trembling. The cabin was quiet again, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone anymore. The wind outside howled once more, but there was something different about it, something that felt like a warning. And then the whispering began. The snowstorm outside had turned the town of Waverly into a ghostly winter wonderland. Inside her small apartment, Lily sat in front of the fireplace, cradling a glass of wine. It was Christmas Eve, and like every year, she was alone. Her family lived miles away, and after a breakup just months before, she had decided to skip the usual holiday chaos. As the fire crackled, Lily's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from an unknown number. She frowned, tapping the screen to open it. "Happy holidays, Lily. I hope you enjoy your gift. It's waiting for you." Confused, she looked around her apartment. The door was locked, the windows shut tight. She hadn't received any deliveries. Who could this be from? A shiver ran down her spine as she stood and walked to the door. There, hanging on the doorknob, was a small, beautifully wrapped gift. Lily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't remember ordering anything, and there was no way anyone could have left it so quietly. Cautiously, she opened the door, but no one was there. Just the gift, sitting innocently in the cold night air. She hesitated for a moment before bringing it inside, setting it on the coffee table. As she unwrapped it, the strange feeling in her gut grew. Inside, there was a small antique music box. It was delicate, with intricate engravings of a snowy village and a couple dances. Lily's breath caught when she opened the box. The soft, haunting melody began to play, but something was off about it. The tune was, she couldn't place it. It wasn't like any song she had heard before. The music echoed through the apartment, filling the silence. Then, as if guided by some unseen hand, the lights began to flicker. Lily stood frozen in place. The air grew cold, and she could hear faint whispers in the "Lily!" She spun around, but no one was there. Her heart hammered in her chest as she approached the music box again. The whispers grew louder, and the melody twisted into something darker, and then she saw it. In the reflection of the glass covering the music box, Lily could see a shadowy figure standing behind her. She turned to face it, but again, there was no one, just the empty room and the soft, eerie melody filling the silence. The whispers came again, this time louder, more frantic. "Lily, you shouldn't have opened it." Her breath caught in her throat. She was no longer alone. The figure behind her took a step forward, and Lily's heart stopped as she turned to see who or what it was. A pale figure, dressed in tattered clothing, its face a blur of shifting shadows, was standing in the doorway. It smiled at her, its lips stretched too wide. "You opened the gift," it said in a voice like cracking up. The music stopped abruptly. The room fell into complete silence. And then, with a sudden violent force, the lights went out. In the darkness, Lily could hear the sound of footsteps, growing closer, closer. The next morning, Lily's neighbors found her apartment untouched. The door was locked from the inside and the windows sealed shut. But Lily was gone. On the coffee table, the music box sat, its melody playing softly, as if it had never stopped. And on the floor was a small note, written in a shaky hand, "You should never have opened." It was Christmas Eve, and Sarah had just finished decorating her front yard with twinkling lights and a beautiful pine tree. Her family was gathering for a cozy holiday dinner, but as the night fell and snowflakes began to fall gently, Sarah decided to step outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The air was crisp, the snow on the ground was fresh, and the world felt peaceful. As she stood by the front door, gazing at the night sky, she noticed something strange. Another snowman had appeared on her front lawn. She frowned, her thoughts racing. She had built one earlier with her son, Jack, but this one was different. It was larger, unnervingly lifelike, and the eyes were different. Instead of the usual coal, they were made of small, black stones, oddly shiny, almost like they were reflecting the light from the house. Sarah hesitated for a moment, wondering if one of her neighbors had decided to prank her, but there was no sign of anyone around. The snowman stood tall, unnervingly still, in the soft glow of the streetlight. She stepped closer, her heart beginning to race. The snow around the base of the snowman was darker than the rest of the fresh snow, as though it had been disturbed recently. Her mind wandered to the old stories her grandmother used to tell her about the curse of the snowman, tales of vengeful spirits trapped in the cold, using the snowmen as vessels to torment the. But she quickly dismissed them as nothing more than folklore. It was just a snowman, right? But as she stood there, she began to feel a growing unease, an unsettling feeling that she was being watched. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought she saw something flicker in the snowman's eyes, a faint glint of red, like the reflection of something sinister. Shivering, she turned to head back inside. But before she could reach the door, she heard it, a low, guttural. The snowman's head shifted. Sarah froze, her blood turning cold. She stared at the snowman, certain she had imagined. The wind had probably moved it, or perhaps it was an illusion. But then, the snowman's head tilted slightly, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The eyes were now glowing a faint, menacing red. "Jack!" she called out, her voice trembling. But the house was silent. As she took a step back toward the door, a soft whisper came from the snowman's direction. "Don't leave." The voice was faint, raspy, and yet somehow familiar. Sarah spun around, her mind racing. She took a step forward, closer to the snowman, her eyes fixed on its glowing eyes. The snow beneath it was now stained a deep, almost black color. It was as though the snowman was alive, feeding off the darkness of the night. "Jack?" she called out again, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper came again, louder now. "Don't leave. I need you." And then, before Sarah could react, the snowman's mouth opened, the carved grin stretching impossibly wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth inside. "Stay with me," the voice hissed, the snowman's body starting to shift and twitch, as if it were coming to life. Panicked, Sarah ran to the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. She struggled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Her heart raced as she realized that she was trapped outside with the cursed snowman. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, as the snowman began to move, its limbs creaking and cracking as if coming to life. It took slow, deliberate steps toward her, its twisted grin never fading, its eyes glowing bright red now. "Stay with me," it whispered again, its voice turning into a chilling growl. Sarah's mind was a blur of fear and confusion. She screamed, slamming her hands against the door, but it was futile. The snowman was getting closer, its enormous form casting a long shadow across the yard. Just as it reached her, Sarah turned, stumbling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She ran toward the backyard, hoping to escape, but the snowman followed, its steps slow but relentless. Then, the world around her began to darken, the snow thickening in the air, swirling around her like a blizzard. She could feel the cold creeping into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. The air grew suffocating, and the wind howled as if it were alive. She couldn't escape. And then, just as she thought she might lose her mind to the terror, she heard it again, Jack's voice, faint but clear, coming from the direction of the house. "Mom, don't go." Her heart skipped a beat. She spun around, her eyes searching the yard for her son, but there was no sign of him. The snowman's growl grew louder, more demanding. It was coming closer, and Sarah had nowhere left to run. With a final desperate cry, she ran toward the snowman, the only thing she could do. But as she got closer, everything froze. The world, the air, the snow, everything came to an unnatural halt. Then, everything went black. The next morning, Sarah's family found her lifeless body frozen in the snow, her eyes wide open in fear. The snowman was gone, but the footprints around her were strange, large and unnatural, as though they were left by something far too big for this world. The house was silent, empty, but the lights on the front yard flickered, and as the first rays of sunlight touched the ground, the faintest sound of a whisper could be heard on the wind. "Stay with me."